So welcome to Conversations with a Cop, and we've got Latent Print Supervisor Rachel Forbes here to tell us what it is she does. Take it away. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. It's great to be here. So my name is Rachel Forbes. I work for the Seattle Police Department in a civilian capacity. So that means I'm not a sworn officer. I don't carry a firearm. I don't go and chase the bad guys down. In that kind of sense, I'm more on the science side of things. We're trying to find the bad guy through evidence and evidence collection. So a little about myself. I've worked for the Seattle Police Department for 11 years. Prior to working for Seattle, I worked for the Sacramento Police Department in California. I was a forensic investigator there, so that is more like a crime scene investigator position. Again, it was a civilian position. And then prior to that, I grew up in Wisconsin and I worked for the medical college there. My degree is in chemistry with a forensic science emphasis. So I have a science background. My intention was always to go into forensics. And so right after I got done with college, I kind of just started applying everywhere that was hiring throughout the country, hoping to get my foot in the door in a forensic science career. So again, started off doing crime scene investigations, so that's a lot like what you see on TV, not exactly the same, but similar. We were the photographers, we were the evidence collectors, we did video on crime scenes, we also processed for fingerprints, and we processed for footwear impressions or collected footwear impressions if they were on scene. Then we also had a laboratory in California where we go back and also process evidence for fingerprints there. So there's only certain techniques that you can use on scene. You don't want to bring hazardous chemicals out on scene. Those are things we have to use in the laboratory. So if we can collect evidence on scene and bring it to the lab, then we can use liquid chemicals to process those items for fingerprints. So I was doing that in California. When the budget crisis hit around 2008 through 2010, as you probably experienced as well, a lot of cities had to cut their budgets and figure out how they could do more with less. And so they ended up laying off a lot of civilian employees in California. And at that point, I put my resume out there again, like I did when I got out of college, and applied up here with the Seattle Police Department and got hired on in the Latent print unit. So now my job is really specifically to do with fingerprints. We're not dealing with the other types of evidence that's being collected, but specifically just with fingerprints. Here in Seattle, the officers are trained to process fingerprints when they respond to a crime scene. So when they go out for a residential burglary, or maybe if somebody's car was broken into and stuff was stolen, the officers will often take the report and then also process that item or that scene for fingerprints. We get those fingerprints that they develop, and we do the analysis on those. We also occasionally will go out for major crimes. So if there's a homicide or a rape or a person-involved crime, then people from our unit will go out along with the crime scene investigators. So here in Seattle, that's a sworn position. So different than what it was when I was a crime scene investigator in Sacramento, here in Seattle, the crime scene investigators are a specialized unit of sworn officers. So you have to do a certain amount of time as an officer with the police department to then be able to apply if you're interested in doing the crime scene side of things. If that's something that interests you, then those are sworn officers and they're on call and they respond for those major crimes. They're doing the photos and the video and most of the evidence collection then. If they want fingerprint processing, they will call our unit out, the Latent Print unit, and somebody from our unit will respond specifically to process for fingerprints. So we do go out on occasion, but most of the time we're actually more of an office or lab job. So we're looking at those fingerprints that the officers lift, but then officers also collect evidence from scenes and submit it to us, and we process that in a laboratory that we have. And so there are different types of surfaces when we're talking about items of evidence, and it makes a difference, that type of surface, as to what kind of process we are going to use to develop fingerprints. So your non-porous surface, like the tiles I have up here, And like the glass in a window or the outside of a vehicle, those surfaces are where liquid doesn't soak in but sits on the surface. When we leave fingerprints behind on a surface, the constituents of that residue is often like sweat and some oils and things that are on our fingers that we leave on a surface. So for those non-porous surfaces like glass and tile, that residue sits on the surface of that item. For porous items like newspaper I have up here, or maybe an envelope or a letter, the residue soaks into those surfaces. So if you think about it, when you drop a bead of water on something, if it soaks in, that's a porous item. And the same is going to happen when we touch things with that sweat and residue on our fingers. That's going to soak into that paper surface. And so we have to use liquid chemicals on those types of items that also soak in to that paper and that surface and develop those prints. So an officer on scene isn't going to process mail or the Amazon packages that may be broken into. You have, mail theft happening or package theft happening. They're going to collect those items and send them to our lab. And then we can use the liquid chemicals on those items to process for fingerprints. And so latent, if you don't know, because obviously that's the name of our unit, latent print unit, latent means not readily visible. So when we touch an object, it often isn't apparent to us that we've left a fingerprint behind. Sometimes on like glass, you can kind of see it if you're looking at a certain angle, right? You can see fingerprints on a glass window. But a lot of surfaces, you're not going to readily see those fingerprints. There needs to be some processing for us to develop them and see them. And so oftentimes we'll use things like a flashlight and kind of like side lighting a surface so you can see the fingerprint residue on it, right? That helps us know where we need to process something. But we also use fingerprint powders, which is probably what you kind of see on those CSI TV shows, right? Where they're dusting with a brush and there's kind of powder going all over. That's something we do use, so those TV shows are accurate. Those are things that officers have in their toolkits that they'll take out to crime scenes and process with. So that powder adheres to the residue we're leaving behind on a surface and develops that print so we can see it. It adheres and it's black most times. They have all different colored powders. There isn't necessarily a benefit to using a red powder or a pink powder. We default to the black carbon-based powder, and that usually is enough contrast on the surface for us to see that powder. And once that print is developed, now we have to have a way to preserve it. So we can take a photo of that print on the surface, but we can also use tape to put over the top of the print, so then that powder now adheres to the tape, and we pull the tape off of there and we put it on a white background. So now I have a black fingerprint in powder, right? That's adhered to a white card. So that contrast is great, and that's a lot of times what we get from the officers. They're taking and processing different points of entry at a crime scene, or maybe a broken window for fingerprints with the black powder, and then they're lifting those prints and sending them to our unit. And we're looking at those prints and deciding if there's enough detail there for us to make a comparison. Now, detail, we're looking at the patterns. So some of you may be familiar. So we have 3 main patterns in your fingerprints. And you might go back to your room today and start looking at your fingerprints. And sometimes with a magnifying glass, that's helpful. But we have whorls, which are like circles in the middle of your finger, right? And then we have loops, where the ridges come in and they go up and they loop around and they go back out the same side they came in on. And those can come from either direction. So you got left loops and right loops coming in. So you might have loops on your fingers, or you have arches. And that's where it kind of looks like a hill or a mountain, and the ridges go up and then they kind of go back down and out the other side. So those are the 3 main types. We have whorls, loops, and arches. And everybody has some of, or one of, or a couple of those patterns on their fingers. And so those are a general category of a fingerprint. But within there's even more details. So those ridges that we have on our fingers, they're there for us to be able to grip things. If you had smooth skin, like you do kind of on your arms or other parts of your body, you would not have that same friction to grab and hold objects. That's the point of having that textured skin, and it's on the bottom of your feet as well. So when people used to not wear shoes as much, that kind of gave you that grip on the ground so you could walk. And it's called friction-rich skin, and it's unique to you. So the patterns and the details that you have on your hands and on the bottom of your feet is only yours. Like, no one else is going to have the same patterns and the same detail that you have. And that's what makes it makes us able to use that to identify an individual. And so the patterns that we have, that's what we're looking at. And there are ridges that run and then they end, or they bifurcate into two ridges, or they're short little dots. So if you go back later and you're trying to look at those details, you've got different unique details in your fingers and on the bottoms of your feet as well, those ridges, and that is unique to you. And those are the details that we are looking at as latent print examiners. And we're looking to see that there's a sufficient amount of them so that we can compare those prints to a suspect set of prints, or we can run them in something called AFIS, which you probably may have heard of on TV as well. It's the Automated Fingerprint Identification System. So we have a local system for King County it's comprised of the fingerprints of all individuals who have been arrested, as well as all law enforcement. So my fingerprints are all in that database as well. And then certain permits and jobs require people to be fingerprinted as well. So if you have a conceal and carry permit, you have to have your fingerprints in that database as well. So we go ahead, if we've got prints from a crime scene and we don't have a suspect name, so they don't know who broke into the house, we're going to run those prints through the database and see if we can find a match. So the database is not like you will watch on TV where it like lights up and then it's like flashing and there's a picture of a person and you're like, oh, the machine did it, it's all over with. We get a list of candidates when we run a print through the system. So the system looks at the fingerprint that we are running and it creates like a constellation. So those events that I was telling you about, the ridge endings and the bifurcations and those dots, we mark all those in the print, and the computer algorithm draws a constellation between those points, and it looks at the distance and the spatial relationship, and then it searches that constellation against everything else in the database. And then it comes back with a list of candidates, and it says, okay, these are the candidates that look like they have that same constellation in them. And now the examiner, myself, and my coworkers have to go look at those side by side. So our latent and our unknown source print compared to these known prints and decide, are they a match or are they not a match? And so that's a good chunk of our day is spent doing something like that. We're doing an on-screen comparison. In the old days, there was a lot of like bending over with magnifiers, kind of looking side by side. Thankfully, it's a lot more digitized these days, so you're not, hurting your back and hunched over all day long looking at fingerprints. We do a lot of that comparison on a computer screen. We can zoom in and zoom out, which is super helpful. And we can do charting where we're marking corresponding minutia events or those ridge events and deciding if a print is the source that we found, the suspect that we have. That database also has palm prints in it, so it's not just, we don't just touch things with those patterned areas on our fingers. We obviously grip things, even cups when you're thinking about drinking something. You're getting parts of your palm in contact with that surface as well. So those palm areas are also recorded in the database, and we can search those as well when we find those on surfaces. And so we're spending a good chunk of time doing that. We're also, like I said, working in the laboratory. So we get quite a bit of evidence that gets submitted: firearms, paper, mail, demand notes from robberies, some drug paraphernalia. So all those things come into the lab, and then we are also processing those with chemicals, some of which I brought some examples of, at least some processed items that have been treated with those chemicals. With paper items in particular, we have the ability to process with a chemical called anhydride. Anhydride actually reacts with the amino acids, so some of that, those secretions that might be on our fingers, and it turns the prints purple, which is pretty neat. So you actually apply the chemical and then you put it in a heat and humidity chamber. So a chamber that warms up and it's got some moisture in the air. That's necessary for the reaction to occur. And you can watch and the prints will start to develop purple and kind of get more and more dark as they're in that chamber. And then when you take it out, that paper will be photographed. So that's not something where we can take tape on there and lift it off. But because again, the prints are soaked into the paper, that purple chemical is now in the paper as well. So we'll need to take a photograph of that fingerprint, and then we can search that print also in the database or compare it to a subject if we have a name in this case. We also have chemicals that fluoresce. So fluorescence is when you use a particular wavelength of light and you send it in on an object. And the object and the chemical that's on that object actually absorb some of that light, some of that energy. And then when you take the light source back, it has to release that energy at some point. It's releasing that energy at a slightly different wavelength. So today I brought some goggles with me. The intention of the goggles block out that real intense wavelength that you're sending in on the object so that you can see the fluorescence or that released energy wavelength, that different color, and then you can also snap a picture of those prints today. So we're gonna take a look at some stuff with the goggles, hopefully maybe near the end, so you can come up here. I don't have enough for everybody, but we can share. And I brought what we call an alternate light source. So that again is a light source that's sending in a single wavelength of light, and then we can see that fluorescence of those prints that have been treated with a particular chemical. Another thing we use, and you've probably seen on TV, is super glue fuming. So it is exactly what it sounds like. We heat up some super glue in a chamber. It becomes a gas. That gaseous super glue has an affinity for the chemicals and the oils that are kind of on our fingers, that residue that we're leaving on a surface. That super glue has an affinity for that moisture. And so it goes and adheres to that moisture on those items that are in the chamber with the super glue gases. Then we cool that chamber down again, and the super glue at room temperature is more of a liquid, solidy phase, you know, that kind of thick glue when you're squeezing it out. It's adhering to the items and actually coats them in kind of like a white coating, and then that kind of preserves the prints for us. And so that allows us, our fingerprints when we touch things are pretty fragile. Again, it's just the residue, sweat, amino acids, a little bit of the water that we're carrying around just because we're a large portion of water our bodies are, and that sweat that we're giving off is mostly water. So those prints on a surface can easily be wiped off. And so the idea of the super glue is that it makes a print more durable and more permanent on a surface. So it's not as easily wiped off. And then we can use those chemicals that I talked about that fluoresce. We can treat that super glue with those fluorescent chemicals and then take a photograph of those prints. And that's another way that we can then preserve prints and also use them to search the database or compare them to a subject. I'm trying to think of what else. We testify in court. That's another part of our job quite frequently. So we have to testify if we identify an individual or if we don't identify an individual. All of that's evidence that needs to be presented in a court of law. And so we do that for city, county, and federal court frequently. And another chemical we use. So oftentimes on crime scenes there can be some blood. And so sometimes there's prints left in very faint blood or very obvious blood. We have a chemical that reacts with the protein in blood, and so it develops those prints, and it makes them turn like a blue-purple color. So probably slightly hard to see from where you're at, but at least the color difference you can probably see because these are white tiles. and these prints were in blood, not a lot of blood either, sometimes not enough even to be readily visible, that red color originally, but there's enough of that blood protein there that when we hit it with the amino black, or this chemical that reacts with blood protein, they turn this very dark shade of blue-purple. And so this is another chemical that we have in our arsenal to use. We have used it frequently in the lab, but this is something else we will take out to crime scenes and process. When you have crime scenes that involve blood, this is a great chemical to help develop prints that may be kind of in a faint amount of blood. So, does anybody have any questions as of yet? Yes?
What percentage of the population in King County would have fingerprint records in your database?
Yeah, I don't think it's a high percentage. I don't know the exact amount, but I'm going to estimate maybe 15 to 20% the most. I think it's a low amount.
And you said yours is in King County, then what would be the next group of database?
Yep.
County or state?
State. So then it goes to Washington State has its own database, and then we have a database called the Western Identification Network. So that's Idaho, Washington, Nevada, Oregon, and Alaska. And that's a database. And then there's the federal database that has the fingerprints from all the different states. One of the main, I think, points of contention, at least one of my main complaints in the job, is that these are not the same database. So the interoperability is kind of a deterrent. We start at one, and that is the local one, King County, is one company that has that database, and we search that. If we do not identify a print in that database, we can go to the state, but it's a separate platform. It's an entirely new search in their database. So I think in a perfect world, they would all be in the same database, and you could start locally and then just kind of say, okay, I want to increase, my range and go out and out and out, and it would just be one search, one markup. But right now, it's different platforms. We have actually different computer terminals that we use to initiate those searches.
And to repeat that question, is the percentage of King County residents that are fingerprinted in the database, right?
Right, that was initially, and it's very low.
Did you want to ask a question?
No, the second question was, what do they do? How do they get out of King County and look further?
Oh, how do they get out of King County and look further? Okay, I just wanted to capture that. So, and I have the microphone if others have questions.
Yeah, I'm curious to know what fingerprints are in your file. I volunteered for a volunteer job working with children and had to have my fingerprints taken to see if I was
A bad person.
a predator or such. Are my fingerprints in that file?
No, you were probably just searched against the database to see that you weren't in there and didn't have a record. So they wouldn't have put you in there for that reason alone. Majority are people who have been arrested. That's the vast majority. And then law enforcement is probably the next chunk because we have to be in that database. Our fingerprints are all in there. And then conceal and carry permits are another.
Service also?
Service, but they're a separate database. We don't generally get access to the military database. We have to have special clearance to get access to the military one. Yep. Any other questions?
I have a question. Please.
Let's get Jack and then we'll get Jennifer.
How do you decide when you want to take fingerprints? Is there certain kind of crimes or situations where you take them and others that you decide it's not worthwhile?
Well, I would say they should be taken in almost all circumstances and all crimes. And I know that, like I said, the officers are all trained, so they're supposed to be taking them even on property crimes, like a home burglary or a car prowl. I know that as of right now in Seattle, we are very short on the amount of officers that are out there. And so I know that oftentimes victims are having to make reports online, and so an officer doesn't actually respond to take the report. And obviously in those circumstances, circumstances, there's no one that's coming out to actually take the prints. But in all instances where if you don't have video surveillance showing somebody's wearing gloves, then I would say we should be processing for prints, because I think they're a form of being able to identify somebody that's, again, unique to you and whoever, you know, was touching that object. That print is unique to them. So it's a means of making an identification, and is an easy route to do so because fingerprint processing is not extremely difficult. So, I mean, all our officers are trained, all the detectives are trained, they should be doing it. But like I said, I think it's an issue of limited staffing right now, so oftentimes there isn't an officer responding for some of those property crimes. The reports are being filed online. So in those circumstances, no one's there to take the fingerprints, sadly.
I have a quick question.
Yes.
And just it's a little bit silly, right? So on TV and on like the crime TV shows, people kind of display this ability to alter your fingerprints, like by burning or chemicals or like cutting your fingers, and then it changes your prints. Can you speak a little bit to if that's accurate? Is that something we see? Is that totally horse pucky? What is that? And tell us a little bit about how we can maybe prevent that, or what does that look like?
Sure. Yes, so that is a thing. You can alter your fingerprints. So if you damage or hurt yourself to the extent that you're bleeding, you're cutting through the layers of your skin all the way down. So you're damaging what we call the basal layer of your skin. So when that skin comes back together to repair itself, as you probably maybe seen on your own injuries, there's going to be a scar there, right? You're gonna have what happens is the skin kind of stitches itself back together, right? And so you have kind of a little pit in your skin now. So there are criminals and people who have attempted to make enough of those cuts right in their skin that they have changed. When we take their prints, they change what it looks like because there's all these marks and scars in there. However, now that print is even more unique because you have all of these scars and stitching areas. So it's an attempt at, at changing things, but they've actually made that impression more unique by putting scars there. Another thing that people will do is try to burn off their skin, right, with acid. And if you've ever had an acid or chemical burn, that pain is horrible, and you are physically burning off your skin, right? But your skin is constantly regenerating. That basal layer that I'm talking about is constantly regrowing because we are shedding skin cells all day long. Skin cells are coming off of the surface, those are dead, and new growth of skin cells are regenerating all the time. So that basal layer of skin is constantly regrowing the same pattern on your fingers. And that's structured all the way down to the bottom. So those areas that are raised up are ridges, and those lower areas, those furrows, that pattern is in the lowest layer of skin, is where that's developing and growing up from. So while we can burn off the top layer, right, and for a period of time our skin may look burned and damaged and smooth, but as it regenerates and it's growing back, you're gonna get the return of those patterns that are there because that's way in the bottom layer of your skin. So yes, I mean, attempts are made, and criminals throughout history there's been stories about them who have tried to burn off. Others have cut other parts of their skin and stitched it on to their fingers. But again, you just made that super unique now. Like, who else has flat skin on their fingers? Like, I think the thought is creative, but at the end of the day, it isn't gonna win them over from not getting identified. They just made their fingerprint more unique than it was before by doing such strange things. So, it's a thing, it happens.
Thank you. I was wondering if that was total BS or if it was real, so thank you.
You're welcome.
Hiya, so I've been fingerprinted for both my job and for other various jobs, and I've always been told it's been really hard because I have really soft hands.
Mm-hmm.
Do you guys find it's easier to pick up prints when people have softer hands, or like if you prefer calluses because it makes it more unique, or what?
Yeah, excellent question. So I think some people, this sounds strange, but some people leave good prints and some people don't. And sometimes it is dependent on your job. So we find that people who work a lot with paper and are kind of filing through things, they're taking that moisture off of their fingers quite frequently, and they're wearing down those surface ridges. So the distance between the furrows, those lower portions, and those raised portions, the ridges, kind of gets slothed down quickly, and so their prints are harder to roll that detail, because we put ink on your fingers when we go and roll them, right, to record them. If you've ever been fingerprinted for a job, oftentimes they'll use ink, and so if you have less pronounced ridges, the ink sometimes fills in the lower portions too, and so that pattern is harder to record on the surface. So that is very true, and some people don't sweat a lot. And so I'm kind of one of those people who's always cold and my hands are always freezing. And so we don't really have a ton of sweat and residue on my fingers. So when we go to plant prints in our office, because we want to use it for practice, you know, or we need a test print because we always test our chemicals before we use them on real evidence, I'm not a good person to put prints on something because my hands just don't have a lot of moisture and residue to leave a good print on the surface. So that does vary from person to person, and obviously from criminal to criminal too. So some criminals, you know, they touch anything and they're leaving prints on them, and others, same as me, maybe their hands are constantly cold, they're not leaving great prints on the surface.
One more question.
Well, it has to do with this very subject. I worked in IT pretty much my whole career, and a friend of mine, she was still working at the time, trying to get the TSA pre-check, and you have to have fingerprints taken for that. And she couldn't get it because her fingerprints were too worn, maybe because they were soft. But also the fellow said, oh, we get a lot of IT people who've been working for many years, you know, and so that's another reason, pounding on.
Yes.
I mean, back in the day, that wasn't easy keyboards, so.
Right.
Yeah.
Right, and there has been some studies now recently where there has to be some consideration for the aging of fingerprints as well. So as we age, and we probably find that the skin becomes looser in other areas of the body, the same is true of the fingerprints. And so you also get a lot of the wrinkles and creasing in the fingers that develop over time. And so you're going to see more of that as a person ages. And so consideration has to be given, because you're not going to, so if somebody's printed when they're 30, you're not going to see quite as many wrinkles and creases. But then when somebody's 65 or 70 and they're printed again, those patterns are still there, but there's going to be a lot more creasing and wrinkles in there to kind of overlap and contend with. So we're still going to have ridge endings, we're still going to have bifurcations, but now we're going to have a lot of creasing running in those prints. And as you kind of pointed out, there's those ridges get worn down. So that adherence to that basal layer, where I said kind of everything is developing and growing up, your skin is still doing that as we age, but that adherence is not as tight. So the definition in a ridge and a furrow where it goes up and comes down kind of gets worn down as time goes on, so it's not as clear when somebody's fingerprinted, and that might be, you know, maybe what your friend ran into, where they couldn't differentiate a ridge and a furrow, and we need to be able to do that to see those patterns in order to be able to identify somebody. So. Yeah, excellent questions.
Are the ridges and so forth the same on all fingers?
So no, they're not. Each of us has different patterns on each finger. So each finger is unique, and each finger is different from everybody else's 10 set of fingers. So on some of mine, I have whorls, and on a couple I have loops as well, and those are each unique. So when we go and run a print through the database, oftentimes we don't know if it's a thumb or an index finger or a little finger. We just search the whole database, right? Because all we can tell is where those ridge events are happening, where there's bifurcations or a ridge ending. Sometimes we can see the whole pattern on a finger, we can see that it's a whorl. Sometimes we don't even see that. If you touch things, you think about it, oftentimes it's the tips of your fingers that are kind of on things, and that's beyond where that pattern is too. So we have to search the whole database, and because each of these fingers is unique, and oftentimes like when we develop them on a surface, we don't know which finger or which hand even. You know, somebody might be left-handed, their primary hand is their left when they're touching stuff, whereas somebody else, their primary hand is their right. So, good question.
Oop, just 1 second.
If the people brought in a window, if they wear a glove, can you take a fingerprint? If they wear gloves?
So if somebody wears gloves, generally not, but some of those criminals are not the sharpest tools in the shed, and they will leave the gloves. So they think they're super smart because they wore gloves, right? And then like on their way out, they dump the gloves. Well, we can develop prints on the inside of gloves. Not fabric ones necessarily, fabric like the shirts and the pants that we're wearing today. These aren't good surfaces for fingerprints because of the weaving and stuff. Things with their own sort of texture and pattern are really hard to develop prints on. If you think about a fingerprint, it's kind of like a rubber stamp. So if you think back to when you were a kid and you were using rubber stamps, you put ink on them and then you put stamps on paper and stuff. Some of the surfaces, if you think back, if you ever tried to put like on a wall with like the texture on it, you saw that that stamp image was kind of all compartmentalized now. You couldn't see the whole image of the stamp because parts of the wall are raised and parts of the wall are lowered. So the same is true when we think about putting a fingerprint on a surface. So if that surface is really textured, and one of the things I think about, and I think it's crazy to me, the inside of cars now with that like plastic is so textured, and I'm like, they should not make the inside, like the dashboard and stuff, that weird textured. It's like not a good surface for fingerprints. And so yeah, there's things where it's like we can't, I mean, you're not going to get prints off, and that's like fabric that we're wearing. So fabric gloves are really hard, but those, like the ones we were all wearing during COVID, like those nitrile gloves, those are good for developing fingerprints, and we have a couple chemicals we use in the lab, so we'll develop prints on the inside of those gloves. So some criminals, they think they're super smart, and they like wear gloves, and then they throw them like in the garbage on their way out, and you're like, well, you tried, but just not hard enough. So, yeah.
We all get fingerprints taken when we get our driver's license. Mm-hmm. Do those go into a larger database?
No, so the driver's license prints you don't get put into the APHIS database when you get printed for a driver's license, so don't have to worry. And if you think about it, if somebody is a victim of a crime, you've touched your own stuff, right? Like if it's your house or your car, your fingerprints are going to be all over that. And so oftentimes we try to take some prints from the victims. If we go to a crime scene, we'll collect their prints, because then we can eliminate all the fingerprints that belong to the rightful owners. Otherwise, we spend a lot of time looking at prints that aren't in the database, because it's an innocent person. That's their item of, they're owned, or their car, or their jewelry box, where they touched it. And then, the house got broken into, the car got broken into, and a few prints on there are maybe the suspects, but the vast majority are the victims, and they're not in the database. So it does benefit us. If we respond to a crime scene, we're going to say, hey, can we take your prints? Because we just want to keep them in the case file. We're not going to put them in the database. We just want to eliminate all the prints that belong to you. So we don't spend hours and hours searching for those. And we can spend time just on the ones that aren't yours, that are likely belonging to the suspect, and just search those. So if you ever are the victim of a crime, hopefully that's never, but if they ask to take your fingerprints, they're not going to put those in the database. They're going to use those to eliminate all the prints that belong to you, because you touch your own stuff. Any other question? All right, he's coming with the microphone.
Are using fingerprints helpful in dealing with a stolen car?
Yes, yes, cars are a fantastic surface on the outside especially, and the glass on the inside, and even the underside of door handles. So we do have some suspects that are smarter than the average suspect, and they will like WD-40 like the inside of a car thinking they're getting all the fingerprints off, right? So they'll wipe down everything, but they often forget the underside of the door handles, or that part of your car door that like closes in the door, you know, like when you open it and it's kind of that, it's always clean because it's not really exposed to rain or dust or debris. That's another great spot where people forget to like, oh, if I'm a bad guy, I should wipe that down. And I often find prints on that inside of the door and the underside of the door handle. So we process cars quite frequently for prints. We have a processing garage actually where we work. And I would say I've lifted 91 of those lift cards from one car. Like every surface on the outside obviously is great. But then a lot of them have that new touch screen, so that's another surface that's great. And your rear view mirror, if you think about it, when people shift that, oftentimes they put their thumb on there to kind of adjust it. So if somebody's stealing a car, they probably are not the same height as the original driver, so people are oftentimes adjusting that rear view mirror, and that's another great surface for finding a fingerprint. So, good question.
Any other questions, or should we take a closer look at the other? Ooh, we got one more.
I have a quick question for you.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
So you spoke a little bit about people who have really cold hands and like not a lot of moisture, so it makes it difficult sometimes to grab the fingerprints. I have clammy hands, and when I got my fingerprints done, it was like a disaster. They had to try like 6 different times because my hands are like moist. Right. Is that also, I mean, similarly to having sort of soft hands, is that also a challenge when you have somebody who has kind of clammy hands?
Yes, very true. Well, what happens is if you have a lot of moisture on your fingers, it's filling in the furrow. So it's like a water would fill in like a canyon, right? If you have a lot of moisture on your hands, it's filling in those lower portions. So when you go to put ink on there, now the ink fills in those lower portions. It mixes with the water, and the ink sits on the higher portions. So now when you go to like roll those fingerprints, the whole thing is just one black blob. So that is an issue, and it's an issue when we go to take elimination prints. Like when I'm doing them for a victim, I have to make sure that they like dry their hands really well, oftentimes with like a paper towel to kind of absorb that moisture and then work relatively quickly to try to take their prints before it comes back. And it's true too then for that person leaving prints. So your prints, if you're leaving them on surfaces, are probably not going to have that same level of detail, again, because the moisture is filling in the valleys. And so when you touch something, you're kind of just leaving a blob or an outline of the finger as opposed to actually having the raised and lowered portions like a stamp would. And so it does, and I've seen some prints that are just an outline, and there is no detail. And that, I mean, there's nothing there for us to compare then. We need to see those details and those furrows and those valleys in there to be able to identify. So, yeah, good question.
Thank you.
Any other questions? All right, I'm gonna put my mask on, and then if you're welcome to come up here, I feel like it would be easier. I can pass some stuff around if people don't feel comfortable coming up as well. I have some goggles. We can take a look at a few items with our alternate light source as well, so you can see kind of some of the fluorescent chemicals that we use. I think a lot of this stuff is pretty fun. I have some tiles here. If you want to put your prints on one of these tiles, then I can develop those with what we call magnetic powder. So it's like that black carbon powder I was talking about, except it has some magnetic properties to it, so it adheres to our wand that we apply it with. It's less messy than black carbon powder. I was a little afraid to bring that in here today and make a mess. It gets all over. We leave crime scenes and people are like, oh, you have stuff here and here, and I'm like, I know. It's just gonna get worse before it gets better. So, but we can try with the magnetic powder, and you can take a look at that. It's pretty cool. So anybody wants to come up can come up.